80 years ago, the world was struggling to come to terms with the aftermath of the bloodiest war in history and facing up to some of the most monstrous crimes imaginable. The question for the victorious Allies was how to ensure that justice was seen to be done. A decision was taken that was unique in history. There would be an international trial convened in the German city of Nuremberg. The senior Nazis, men like Hermann Goering, would be placed in the dock, and the trial that followed would change the course of history.
80 years since the Nuremberg Trial began. I'm visiting the Imperial War Museum in London to explore their collection and speak with historian Dr. James Bulgen about the groundbreaking trial and uncover how the Holocaust helped define and lay bare the full extremity of Nazi crimes.
Well, thanks for bringing me to this great gallery. I'm really struck by the fact that there are so many individual stories that collectively make up this tragedy that's too big for us to comprehend. But so let's just try and put some numbers on it. What is the kind of top line figures from the Holocaust?
Well, as you say, the numbers are the thing which are constantly kind of almost overwhelming. I mean, the key number, I suppose, is there are estimated to be about 6 million Jews murdered in what we now call the Holocaust. So unfathomably huge numbers. But of course that breaks down into lots of different areas and territories and series of events. So talk about the ghettos, the hundreds of thousands of people in the ghettos, mass shootings in Central and Eastern Europe. We still don't know, frankly, how many people were murdered in that series of events. Could be up to 2 million people, certainly at least 1.25 million. Then of course we have the death camps that follow where millions more are murdered. So huge numbers, as you say. But of course behind all of those numbers are real people. You know, individual lives, and it's so important to hold on to that.
Yeah, that's what, looking around the gallery, you see those astonishing numbers and you can't comprehend them, then you get down to just one little girl writing, it's just astonishing.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the thing which is so important to hold on to, that these were just real people going about their lives in all these different places. And the thing which is so important too is what the numbers also tell us is how vast the project was in terms of its geographies. And that was really critical, of course, to the way that justice was meted out afterwards, because of course, from the Allies' perspective, they had this crime or series of crimes that spanned across nations. I mean, the geographies are huge and vast. And so the question that they were confronted with was, what do we do about this? These are, as Churchill described it at the time, crimes without a name. There is nothing in the kind of the rule book to determine how something like this should be pursued. And that was something which the sort of the follow-on from the crimes themselves is what to do about it.
Today, the path to Nuremberg might seem inevitable. There was always going to be justice after the war. But at the time, it was anything but certain. So why not just execute, hang, you know who the senior Nazis are, just get rid of them?
Well, there were some people who did advocate for that. I mean, Stalin claimed it was a joke afterwards, but he famously said to Churchill, why don't we just identify 50 to 100,000 people and just take them out and shoot them? The fact is that for other people that was completely untenable, because they said, this is not the way that this should be done. We need to use the tools of justice, because they knew, and this is something which you really get when you read commentary from people at the time, they knew that they were acting in service of history. They knew that they themselves would be judged in the decades that followed based on what had happened in this period of time.
Hundreds of thousands of people were directly involved in the Holocaust. So how did they choose? How many did they choose, and how did they choose them?
Well, it's odd now, isn't it? Because we know about the Nuremberg Trial and we know that there were these 24 people identified as defendants, but that wasn't necessarily clear. Obviously, someone like Goering. Goering was always going to be in the dock.
Sort of Hitler's number two almost, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and former head of the Luftwaffe. He was part of the regime from the earliest days, so he was clearly the most senior remaining member. Because of course that's the other thing to bear in mind, that the people who would have been the first names on the charge sheet had all died by suicide previously. So Goering was obvious, Albert Speer was obvious, former Minister of Armaments and War Production. He's fully complicit in that regime. I mean, one of the things that informed it actually, and slightly strangely in retrospect, all of the allies who were part of the trial, so the Soviets, the Americans, British and the French, wanted to have an important role in the process. And so some of the defendants ended up in the dock for the simple reason that they were in Soviet custody. But the idea was essentially that all facets of the Nazi state would be represented. So military, industry, economy, politics, everything would be there. So it would be a kind of a statement to history of the Allies standing in judgment of the entire Nazi state and infrastructure at one point in time in one place.
This would of course become known as the Nuremberg Trial. For the first time in history, a court would hold a nation's leaders to account for crimes against humanity. In this former palace of justice, the surviving architects of the Nazi regime would face judgment for the horrors they unleashed.
Right, so who's on trial? Who are the defendants? These are some of the biggest names, I guess.
So there's 24 defendants identified for the trial. The number 24, interestingly, wasn't because there was some sort of judicial precedent. It was because they thought 24 would be a kind of a good cross-section, and also because they thought 24 was about the number that they could fit into the benches that they're constructing in the court. So cross-section of different individuals. This man here was always going to be on trial, Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, former deputy leader of the Third Reich. Goering actually surrendered to the Americans because he was so concerned, as were a lot of senior Germans actually, falling into Soviet hands. He would rather kind of take his chances with the Americans. And when he was first arrested, he was treated as a bit of a celebrity by the soldiers who arrested him, because of course they all knew who he was.
He was in all the cartoons, wasn't he? He was
Absolutely.
very famous.
He had this established public image, and so they were taking photos with him and stuff. And this obviously attracted a lot of criticism in the immediate aftermath. When he was arrested, he was also in pretty bad shape physically. He was enormously overweight, and he was addicted to paracodeine. So he had about 20,000 paracodeine pills with him when he was arrested in all of his monogrammed suitcases, etc. He had this huge amount of stuff with him. So it's impossible to know for sure what he was expecting, but I think it's fair to say that he wasn't fully anticipating the extent of the change that he experienced in the weeks that followed.
A decorated fighter pilot during the First World War, Hermann Goering was one of the earliest high-profile members of the Nazi Party. Charismatic and ambitious, he quickly rose through the ranks to become one of Hitler's most trusted allies, eventually holding the title of Deputy Führer and serving as the head of the Luftwaffe. But as the war turned against Germany, Goering's influence waned until he ultimately fell out of favour with Hitler.
His grip on reality was always fairly loose, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the thing with Goering was really important to the Nazi regime from the start. He was able to give the Nazis this kind of legitimacy amongst the aristocracy. So he was a really important figure in terms of broadening Hitler's electoral support in the early stages. But as the war went on, whilst he was nominally a very senior man within the Third Reich, he'd become a bit of an embarrassment in a lot of ways because he'd become addicted to this paracodeine. He was drinking a lot. He was partying a lot, socialising a lot, etc. So he was not necessarily somebody who wielded actual meaningful power towards the latter stages of the war, but he was certainly somebody who had virtually unique status, and by far, I would say, the most senior remaining member of the Third Reich at the end of the war.
I'm really understanding for the first time talking to you that this really is weeks after the end of the war. So they didn't know about things like the Wannsee conference that we now know about, where they really hammered out the minor details of the Holocaust, and people have seen the movie and stuff. So actually they're just sort of going with people that they've roughly speaking heard of who seem high profile and banging them on trial.
Absolutely, and that's a really important thing to bear in mind, that that there is a clarity to some of this history today which absolutely wasn't there at the time. We now know so much more. So they were operating in the immediate present, trying to get a handle on what happened, how they were going to evidence that, and who was responsible for it. So Goering's obvious. Hess is a slightly more tricky proposition.
Rudolf Hess,
who was Hitler's deputy in the early stages of the Nazis, once they came to power in the time before, but famously and very strangely made this autonomous decision to fly to the UK in 1941 to try and seek a meeting with the Duke of Hamilton, who he'd met previously, and he thought he'd kind of win Hitler's favour by finding a way to...
brokering some sort of peace or...
Exactly.
Once Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess was a close confidant of the Führer in the movement's early years. But in 1941, in one of the most bizarre events of the war, he undertook a solo flight to the United Kingdom on an unauthorised peace mission. His plane crashed in Scotland, and his ensuing capture stunned both the British and Nazi leadership in an episode that continues to baffle historians to this day.
a difficult question for the Nuremberg trial, because of course it's quite easy to position and place Hess as a figure of responsibility in the early years. But of course he's gone by 41, and many of the crimes that will be at the focus of the trial happen after that. But nevertheless, given his seniority previously, he's there. He has become a complex figure by this stage as well, insofar as he's claiming to have amnesia. He's claiming not to be able to remember anything. He's having these bouts of hysterical laughter. He's become a very sort of odd figure, quite embarrassing to the other defendants in the trial. And that will carry on throughout. Interestingly, though, some secret recordings from within his cell would suggest that he was telling the truth about the amnesia. We don't know for sure, and of course we never will, but his behaviour out of public gaze was consistent with his behaviour in public gaze. So an interesting character. And then people like this. So these are three very senior members of the regime. So there's Albert Speer, who is Hitler's personal architect.
And so in charge of trying to keep the munitions flowing and this vast network of factories and with employing slave labourers.
Yeah, and doing an incredible job of it. I mean, this is the really difficult thing. As they went into the war production was going up because of what Speer was doing. So he becomes Minister for War Production and Armament. So very kind of integral figure, and has this personal relationship with Hitler by virtue of, you know, Hitler's interest in architecture, etc. And then here we have Dönitz and Jodl, so two military figures from the Wehrmacht.
In charge of the U-boats,
yeah,
and therefore responsible for lots of crimes at sea, but also then became Hitler's successor.
Absolutely, and interestingly, actually, Dönitz was a relatively controversial selection for the Nuremberg trial, because there were people in the Navy amongst the Allies who didn't want to see a Navy man tried, because of course, you know, as you say, whilst Dönitz was Hitler's successor, that was a surprise to him in the first instance. There was nothing to suggest that would have happened really in the months or certainly years prior. But also, he'd been fighting a war at sea, as wars are fought at sea. Yep. So the suggestion that he was culpable for crimes committed elsewhere.
Almost a dangerous precedent. Okay.
Yeah, and they have this sense that somehow kind of the Navy behave in a decent way, etc. So you know, there's a complex picture there. Then across the rest of the piece, they're trying to find the remaining individuals. They look to things like the Krupp organisations. So they make the decision to put Gustav Krupp in the dock.
He's a big industrialist.
Exactly. He's a totem for German industry. The difficult thing actually is that in retrospect they clearly got the wrong Krupp, because by 1945 he was completely infirm, virtually incapable of speech entirely. He was completely bedbound. Clearly it was Alfred who was the Krupp who should have ended up on trial. By that stage it was too late. Interesting. So Krupp never ended up in the stand, although his name was on the charge sheet. Then you get people like Martin Bormann, of course, who's really important to Hitler, but Bormann is nowhere to be seen.
Missing.
Yeah, missing. It was only in the 1970s, I think, final confirmation that he died by suicide from a cyanide pill on his way out of the bunker. So Bormann, because at that stage, and this speaks to your point about the things we know now, which we didn't know then, at that stage they said, this guy Bormann is really important. He needs to be in the dock, but we've got no idea where he is. So we cannot run this trial without putting his name on the charge sheet. So that's what happens. And then just a cross-section of different people from across the Third Reich, to varying degrees of seniority in various different types of roles.
Scheduled to begin on the 20th of November 1945, Nuremberg would become a global spectacle, an unprecedented moment in history where the leaders of a defeated regime were brought before an international court to face charges of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity.
We got some of these famous, this famous image here of them in the dock together. I mean, I think it's just worth pausing, and how historic is that? I mean, the idea of never before have the top brass of an enemy regime been sort of lined up and tried in this formal way. You know, this would be like Alexander the Great putting all the Persians in the dock together or something. You know, it's an astonishing concept. These images are fascinating.
It's such an important point, and I think it's one of the things that I'm always really keen to be so clear about with this historic trial at Nuremberg, that prior to this point, it was the case that nations were able to behave kind of with total autonomy over their own actions. So a sovereign state could essentially do whatever it wanted to its citizens with no fear of wider repercussions. This is the first time that the world, or certainly the Allied powers as one, say there is an authority beyond the nation, and there are things that you can do that mean that you're answerable for them, even if you're acting within the sovereign state. And so these individuals are the first people in history to find themselves tried by an international court. Huge moment for humanity.
Why do they choose the city of Nuremberg?
So Nuremberg had this symbolic status because it had been central to the Nazi rallies that had been held in
Those
the
classic rallies you've seen pictures of before the war.
Exactly that, with Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light, with these huge light beams going off into the sky and framing the way that the Nazis wanted to be seen by the world. And of course, at one of those Nuremberg rallies, the announcement of the so-called Nuremberg laws was made. But these laws were a really important moment in terms of encoding the persecution of Jews living within the Reich. So there's an ambition for the Allies to say, this place that was so central to your so-called 1,000-year Reich is now ours. And we are going to use that space to prosecute you. And what we see here in these pictures is the type of environment. These pictures are from a lady called Mrs. Rycroft, who was a visitor to the trial. So she was a member of the ATS. But you see here, this is the outside of the courtroom. So the security was established. Security was a huge thing at the trial. Now it seems obvious because it went off without major security consequences. But at the same time, you've got to remember, Germany had only recently been beaten.
And there was lots of chat about sort of extreme elements trying to hold out.
Absolutely that. So you see this is security outside the Palace of Justice. You just see behind the trees there, the Palace of Justice itself. And that was a critical thing in the trial. The palace had taken damage in the war, but it had this one courtroom which could be used. It wasn't fit for purpose as it was. They needed to go in and do work on it. And it was actually being used as a mess for American soldiers at the time, and it was literally a mess as well. You can see here the note. She says here, Nuremberg. It's one of those strange things you think at the time she could have had no idea about how historically significant this moment would be.
But Nuremberg wasn't chosen solely for its powerful symbolism. There was a far more mundane reason that stemmed from its location in the American zone.
You see as well here this image here. It says Club Americana.
Okay.
So this idea that the Americans have gone into this space, because that was the thing that really appealed to certainly the French and the British about Nuremberg, is that it was in the American sector. So that was why the American and British were so supportive of using Nuremberg, because American rations were much better than British or French rations. So they knew that if they were going to be doing this trial within the American zone of occupation, then they would be well looked after.
I thought you were about to say because it would sort of tie the Americans to some sort of international...
No, nothing so significant. I think you find quite a lot in this history. Yeah, basically, cigarettes, hamburgers, booze. And there was a lot of all of that during the trial as well, of course. The Soviets wanted it to happen in Berlin, because the Soviets, Berlin was within their zone of occupation, and it would be a statement for the Soviet Union to the world if it was in their zone of occupation. But the rest of them agreed that it should be Nuremberg, and that's what happened.
With the defendants in custody, the location agreed, and the courtroom prepared, only one question remained. What charges were they going to face?
So we got Speer in the dock here, Goering now. Are they all they've got the same charges?
This is one of the main bones of contention with the Allies, what the charges should be. And eventually they agreed on 4 separate charges. But not every defendant was charged with the same set of offences. So 4 charges amongst them. Of course, Goering was charged with all 4 because he was complicit in so many different parts of the regime. But what they were seeking to do was not just to try them for their conduct during the war and the crimes that were committed there, but also conspiracy. So conspiracy to perpetrate aggressive war, and that was a really important thing that wasn't necessarily universally agreed on amongst the Allies. But they were tried as one set of defendants, but not all facing the same accusations. So they were a set of individuals, but were tried as a group.
And if found guilty, what was the penalty?
So death. That was always on the slate. The death penalty was the kind of the worst repercussion. Interestingly, for some of those in the dock, and Goering was a notable example of this, they were less concerned in some respects about the idea of being executed and more concerned about the manner of execution. So Goering felt, and so did some of the military men in the dock, that if they were to be executed, they should be shot, which was considered by them to be a more kind of glorious way of dying in service of their country. The Allies were never really prepared to contemplate that, and it was going to be hanging. So they all knew that they were potentially facing the hangman's noose, and that to them was anathema. even if they were to be executed, that was the most kind of inglorious way of it happening.
That's how, in their view, common criminals were.
Exactly that. You know, a military man, if he's going to be executed, should stand and face his executioners, and he should kind of take it like a man. And yeah, so that it was almost like literally a fate worse than death from their perspective to be confronted with done like that. And then there were various other things, you know, confronting them, so prison sentences and the prospect of acquittal. You know, that's the thing. I think we think about these things now, and there was a concern about it being a kind of a show trial and the you know, the convictions being a formality. But actually, acquittal was one of the potential outcomes. And of course, it would prove to be the case that 3 of them were acquitted. So there were a variety of different outcomes open to them when the trial started.
The sheer scale and complexity of the crimes meant that the trial would be everything but brief. One of the unexpected challenges the Allies faced was ensuring the defendants lived long enough to stand trial. Fearing further suicides, they took extraordinary measures to make certain each of the accused survived to hear the final verdict.
So one of the big concerns for the Allies was about getting these men to trial and keeping them there once the trial had started, because suicide was a huge issue. They learnt that with him. I've got some letters here from a chap called Dr. Thompson. He was a British medical officer, and he was involved in doing a search of Joachim von Ribbentrop, of course ended up in the trial. He's writing to his wife, and he's describing the process by which he conducted this investigation. So he says in this letter about how he had to do this full bodily exam. So Ribbentrop had to take all his clothes off, and Dr. Thompson talks about how he was able to find something secreted to what he describes as an intimate part of his anatomy.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, he says it must have been really painful for him because the skin looked really raw underneath. But he says here, pushed it down between his legs. I grabbed hold of his wrist and said, if you were looking for poison, I will save you the trouble. There it is. He offered his hand, and there was a little sealed tin with adhesive plaster on it. It had been stuck to an intimate portion of his anatomy. So so clearly the Allies became very conscious of the fact that these suicide vials could be hidden anywhere about the body, and they wanted to be able to get to them.
Because Himmler, the very, very senior Nazi, he had managed to take that despite being in custody.
In British custody.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and it became a thing actually for Allies conducting arrests. The first thing they would do when they saw one of these individuals was to grab their wrists, because they knew the biggest risk was that as soon as they could get their wrist into their mouth, they'd have something in it, they could crunch down on this cyanide. He actually talks here as well, Dr. Thompson, about how when he was then doing the rest of the examination, he was not very delicate. He says, and I wasn't very gentle in my examination. But what's interesting as well, and this is something you see through the trial, is he talks about how all of Ribbentrop's status just dissolved and evaporated through the process. This sense that this man who had this enormous sort of sense of his own status suddenly lost it through the examination, and that became an issue for the rest of the trial. What Dr. Thompson was involved in there was suicide prevention, and it was a really big issue in the way that prisoners were looked after in their cells. The reality was, of course, that at least a number of them were likely to face execution, but the Allies wanted that to happen on their own terms. They wanted to see these men get to court, hear the charges, answer for themselves, and to receive proper justice. They didn't want them to escape that process. So Colonel Andrus, who was the American who was in charge of prisoner welfare, created a set of different procedures as to how the prisoners should be looked after whilst they were in custody. And these things were constantly evolving because, of course, on the 25th of October 1945, Robert Ley, in custody, did manage to kill himself. And so they had to introduce a new set of procedures for dealing with this. So you see here some of Andrus's procedures here. So these are issued in September. Yeah. So this is before Ley's suicide. And he's talking about the various different things that are going to happen. So he says here on the third of these steps, it says removal of all weapons or instruments which might be used for suicide or self-harm. So there was this real concern.
Yeah, take their weapons off them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, genius.
But even things like the desks in their room were collapsible. So if they tried to stand on it with a kind of ligature, the desk would collapse. They had their eyeglasses taken off them at night, so they couldn't break the shards and use them for injuries. So this was issued on the 2nd of September. And then afterwards, you see, it's very scrupulous. You see, the lighting system was completely altered to prevent suicide. Yeah. The other thing they were concerned about, incidentally, was not just necessarily suicide, but also the risk of lone wolf attacks, because there were a lot of people who would have liked to get their hands on these men.
Yeah. So they're being protected from each other, from themselves, from the outside.
Yeah, because now it seems obvious that nothing happened, but if you look back then, you know, there were a significant risk that could happen. Then you see here, the 10th of November, so this is after Lay's suicide, 10 days before the trial starts, then there's a new set of procedures brought in, which are clearly supposed to try and mitigate
even more.
Yeah, the risk of other things happening. So one of the things that starts to happen is there, at night time, there's a sentry at each cell. So for the entire time that the prisoner is asleep, there's a guard staring through the porthole watching them. They have to lie on their back, so that they have to have their hands above the things, and they have a torch shone in their face routinely through the night, because there's this obsession with them taking their own lives. Yeah, so you can see from Andrus's perspective, his sole responsibility was to ensure that this didn't happen. And when Robert Leahy did manage to do it, Andrus felt terrible that he'd sort of failed in this cardinal responsibility that he had. And so these procedures were intended to ensure that could never happen again.
On September the 30th, 1946, after 11 months of proceedings, the accused were led into the courtroom to hear the verdicts that would seal their fate.
So after all of the flurry of activity of the trial and the months and months and months of people being in the stand and witnesses and testimony, all that stuff, the trial pauses for the judges to consider their verdicts. And after that hiatus, they come back together and the judges announce their verdicts. And there's a range of verdicts. As it happens, of the men in the dock, 11 are convicted to be executed, 3 are acquitted, and the rest have varying levels of prison sentence. But of those 11, one of them will escape the hangman's noose, and that is, of course, Hermann Goering.
So he somehow, did he have that cyanide capsule with him? Or?
There are so many different theories as to where it came from, but the bottom line is the night that he was due to be executed, he managed to get a cyanide pill from somewhere and get it in his mouth and crack it before the Allies were able to intercede. So Goering died, but he did so in some respects on his own terms.
So despite all the protocols, they still couldn't stop that happening.
And it is this huge outstanding question as to how he managed it. Like I say, there's lots of people that have got lots of different theories about where it came from, but the bottom line is, whatever happened, however he got it, he did manage to get it.
Rudolf Hess.
So Hess is not executed. Hess is imprisoned for an extended period of time, and Hess will eventually die in prison by his own hand too, but after an extended period of custody. So not executed. Then these 3 men here.
Speer gets lucky, doesn't he?
Speer, and this is one of the probably the biggest question, I think, in terms of kind of justice that the trial still has to answer, as to how Speer managed to escape the hangman's noose. There was, there's been a huge amount of discussion and debate about it in the years since, but he did an interview shortly before his death with an author and historian called Gita Sereni, and as she said, if he had said the things in court that he said to her during that interview, he would have hanged. But he played the system, and he knew what he was doing. And not only that, in later life, he's eventually released and managed to create a kind of almost a media career for himself. He releases a book inside the Third Reich. He ends up on talk shows, and he's interviewed a lot, etc. So he becomes a public figure, and he somehow finds a way of stepping away from the crimes of the regime. It's very, very strange in retrospect. Different story for these two. Dönitz ends up imprisoned, and Jödel ends up being one of those who is executed.
So we've got the full range here, just among these 5.
One man not present in the courtroom, but found guilty nonetheless, was Martin Bormann, who, tried in absentia, was sentenced to death, bringing the total number of death sentences to 12.
Feels like the Allies it was quite weighted towards sort of the slide to war, pre-war, the rise of the Nazis, rather than the last few days and months of that war when monumental crimes against humanity had taken place. People like Hess, people who get like the finance minister, even dare I say Ribbentrop, these are the sort of bogeymen in the years leading up to the war. It's perhaps some of the Allied thinking was sort of focused on the past rather than the...
Well, you do wonder to what extent, obviously, that kind of clarity of what had gone on, certainly in the final couple of years of the war, had emerged. I mean, clearly there was evidence emerging all the time and things were kind of becoming clear. But one of the things about Nuremberg, which is very striking in retrospect, for example, is that there were only 3 Jewish witnesses. So today, you know, the sort of the scale and the magnitude of the Holocaust as a crime of such extraordinary kind of scope is clear to us as a contemporary audience. But at that stage, it hadn't quite emerged with the same degree of clarity. There was coverage of it, and it comes up a lot in the transcripts, etc. But it's striking now that only 3 Jews were able to speak and to testify to what they'd experienced. Clearly, in the decades that followed, that situation would change. So I think you're right. I think it does speak to the proximity of the trial to the end of the war. We're talking months. You know, the war ends in Europe in May 1945 and the trial starts in November. I mean, the pace is incredible and, you know, the scale of the ambition is incredible, but it does mean, of course, moving at that speed, that clarity hasn't necessarily emerged at this stage.
Do you think the Nuremberg trials delivered what the organisers hoped that they would?
It's the big question, isn't it? I mean, I think I'm always struck by the foresight of those involved. I think, you know, when Robert Jackson says in his opening speech, he says, this is the most significant tribute that power has ever paid to reason. I think, what an extraordinary statement to humanity.
People should come to the Imperial War Museum and they can look at all this stuff for themselves.
Yes, so we've got huge collections related to the trial. We've got the documents from the trial for Britain, huge collection. We've got a lot of stuff on display, and we've also got this book, which is going to be published in the next few weeks in November, and this covers off the trial, but very much from a social history perspective. So this is using documents and images from the collection to look at the lived experience of the trial, both from the perspective of the defendants, but also those kind of unseen figures behind the scenes who came together to make history.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today and let me look at some of the amazing things in your collection.
Thank you so much, it's been a pleasure.